Hi everyone, I'm Nagesh Susarla and today Paul Donnelly and I will be talking to you about building end-to-end applications with YUI and YQL. By now you already seen the various features that are offered by YQL and you are at YUIConf, so I'm assuming you know enough about YUI to be dangerous by now, obviously. So with that said, we want to step into this presentation by saying how you can use YUI to get data from YQL and show it in your widgets, etc. To get started, let me start by defining what an application is in my terms. So I think of an application as composed of data and visualization, obviously. For the data part, I get it from a database, be it my MySQL database, which has my user data, for example, or from the various web services that are out there. Now, these could be web services from Amazon, web services from Facebook, Google, local search from Yahoo, Flickr photos, or just random XML or Atom or RSS feeds that you want. So basically, that's your internet for the data. And for the visualization part, you use something like YUI library to make it look appealing and build your entire application. Fair enough. So what are you trying to convince me about? So let's look at what data contains or what happens when you're trying to build an application with web services across the internet. Now you realize that data is available in multiple different formats. Now it's available in XML when it comes to RSS feeds, Atom feeds, etc. You have JSON data, some web services which only return JSON data, whereas some web services which return only CSV data, for example. So if you're building your application to work with multiple data sources, you're faced with this common problem of transforming the data, of having to transform this data from one format to the other. You have two web services, one is XML, one is JSON. You can't directly mash it up together. You have to first get it into a normalized form. So you say, okay, I'll do JSON, get it both into JSON, and then actually do the mashup work with it. So now let's see how YQL changes this picture a bit. Now with YQL, open data tables for that matter, or just plain YQL, it accepts multiple different formats and lets you ask for a particular format, let's say JSON or XML. Those are the formats supported by YQL inherently. Now, in addition to transforming or being the normalizer for all kind of data on the web, it also lets you do open data tables. So you can add your own executes or YQL executes for that matter and do your logic or do your business logic in the cloud. So that's the other benefit of using YQL. So just to recap, it accepts multiple different formats, and in addition to this, I should say it can also accept custom formats if you're willing to write the transformer once for everyone, so others can reuse the work and reuse the work of your table. And for the outputs, it supports JSON and XML obviously, but it also supports the handy JSONP callbacks. So it's JSON callbacks and JSONPX. Now JSONPX is unique to YQL. We came up with it as a way to solve a particular problem. So it is XML payload in a JSON callback. The reason for this is because the translation from XML to JSON is sometimes lossy. In case of HTML pages, for example, it can be lossy because of the way it's structured. So in those cases, you want to use JSONPX so you get XML directly on the client side and deal with the XML directly. So next up is actually YQL is deployed across the world in multiple colos. So when your application is directly using YQL from the front end, for example, then it actually goes to the YQL engines that are closest to your users. Let's take the example of your user in the US. Based on their IP address, it goes to the closest YQL engine which can pick up that request and serve it. Whereas your users in Asia will go to the YQL engines that are closest to them in Asia. So without you having to deploy. If you were to write this application yourself, you would have to deploy it in multiple colos, manage and handle all of that. But YQL gives that to you free. I mean, that's inbuilt into YQL. That's the benefit of YQL. Now, in addition, we also do default caching for 5 minutes. So when we get a resource, when we make a web service call and get the response, it is cached by default unless it's marked as cache control private. We do not cache private data for obvious reasons. And the default is 5 minutes, but for stale data, you can obviously increase this max age to whatever limits you wanted, and that can be specified on the query parameter directly. Now, a little about the various endpoints that we support. I'm just going to introduce this, and Paul is going to actually show you the code behind each of this and how to do two-legged, three-legged OAuth. So first is the public endpoint. This is obvious. It's for public data. It's for accessing the internet feeds, I mean RSS, XML, data feeds, CSV, or the web services which do not require OAuth or which do not require any authentication authorization. That's the public endpoint. Then we also have the authenticated endpoint or the authorization endpoint for OAuth. So YQL supports OAuth and implements it. So you get a chance to do either two-legged OAuth or three-legged OAuth. Now the difference is a small difference in between the two. In two-legged OAuth, there are only two parties involved. That's the application and the web service, which is the data provider. Now here in this case, it's YQL. So the application identifies itself by passing a two-legged OAuth token, by signing it, etc. Now in three-legged OAuth, there are three parties involved, obviously. There are three legs, right? So there are three parties involved. One is the application. Obviously, your application needs to get the data. Second is the data service provider, which is YQL in this case. And the third is the user. So you are making the request to get the data on behalf of the user. So rather than having your users put in their username and passwords into your application and trusting you, they use OAuth to actually do this bounce without having to pass the passwords. So that's the OAuth standard for you. So we support all of these endpoints, and as I said, Paul will talk more about that. So what are the brief steps for application development if you choose to use YQL as your application development tool, right? So the first thing is you pick the open data tables that are needed for your application. Let's say your application uses Flickr photos. It uses some tweets from Twitter. So you look out for an open data table for Twitter. If it uses Foursquare for some reason, so then you use the Foursquare. You look out for this Foursquare open data table. If it uses feeds, then you have RSS table, Atom table, etc. So you look and find to see whether you have the open data tables already done by other people in the community. We have a community hosted GitHub repository which contains all these open data tables. Now, if for some reason your API is not yet there as an open data table, we have around 900 or 850 or something like that open data tables. For some reason, if it's not there, then you can create one, and if you intend to, you can share it in the community. So you can create one and also have your business logic inside that execute. Now, next up is obviously you want to test in the YQL console. YQL console, as Paul will explain, is a very handy tool for you to test and iterate over your data tables. So you build an open data table, see whether you like the response. Now you want to change the shape, you try again, you iterate over it until you get the right format. And it's the best way to form your queries, use projections, add the right filters. So in your application does not have any performance problems. So you iterate over in the YQL console and then take it to your application. Now, obviously, the next step is to take this and show it in the UI with the YUI YQL modules to get the data and show it, visualize it in your actual application. And lastly, obviously, profit. There are no said mandated rules for how you should profit, but I'm hoping you'll profit. And yeah, give me a cut or something like that. So with that, I'd like to actually give it to Paul Donnelly.
So hi, I'm Paul, and I'm part of the YQL team. And what I'm going to cover today is how to access YQL data through our various endpoints and how to use YUI to help you do this. And I'm going to first talk about, starting with the YQL console, give you a quick history on it, a quick console tour, some of the various console parameters that you could add that will help you with your YQL development, and then finish with using YQL data with YUI and how to access the public endpoint, the authenticated endpoint using two-legged OAuth, and how to use YQL storage to keep your two-legged OAuth secrets secure, and how to use three-legged OAuth to access data from YQL. So this is the link that you go to the console if you haven't seen it already. And let me give you a quick history on it. When YQL first came out, the only way to access YQL data was through OAuth. And as many of you know, setting up OAuth takes some time. There's some preparation. So the first thing you need to do is figure out what OAuth is. You need to read up on it and learn it. And then you need to go to the web service provider site to get your consumer key and secret. And then you finally need to know, what libraries you need to use, and if you're going to code your own code to actually do the signing. So there's a lot of time involved. There's a lot of setup. So that's why the YQL console was created. So you can quickly test out your queries without having to worry about the consumer keys and secrets and figuring out the authentication and all those requirements. As time went on, we realized that not all tables needed authentication. So we created the public endpoints. Now, this made it really easy to test out queries. So you could actually put in the public endpoint into your browser, add the queue parameter, add your YQL statement, and just see the results right in your browser and go from there. But still, some tables in YQL require authentication. So the console still today, the main benefit is just getting up and going really quickly to try out your queries and not have to worry about all those pain points. So if you've attended some of the other YQL sessions, you've probably seen the console, but if you haven't, this is what it looks like. On the top part is where you enter your YQL statement, your query. Right next to it is the permalink link, where if you want to share this particular query with your friend, you just click on that, and it actually links to the console with that embedded query in it. By the default, it uses the XML output. You could switch over to JSON really easily. And in the middle part is the XML data that you get back when you run your YQL query. On the bottom part is the REST endpoint, and this is the point that you use in your web application. You don't use the console's URL. This is the point that you want to use in your application. And then on the top part here is the query aliases, and let me tell you a little bit about what query aliasing is. It allows you to customize your YQL query endpoint. So on the bottom here, you can see that this endpoint is really long. There's the queue parameter, and it gives you the URL encoded YQL statement. So what query aliases is where you could first define your user alias, which could be your username or whatever you want it to be, followed by a query alias that, again, whatever name you want it to be, to define the query that you want. And when you first click on the query alias link, it prompts you for the user alias creation, and then it prompts you for the query alias creation. So this folder is where you actually get to see all the query aliases that you created. Why would you want to create a query alias? Well, it might be easier to send it to a friend, or you might just want cleaner code, or you just might want to save favorite queries there. The second one is, the second dropdown is the recent queries, and it uses HTML5 storage. It shows you the last 100 queries that you entered into the console. So it's a great reference to go back to. And then we have the example queries dropdown, which is really good for new users to YQL. So if you have It ranges from simple queries to more advanced queries. Good place to start if you're learning YQL. And then on the bottom is the data tables folder, where it shows all the tables that are loaded into your environment. By default, it uses the Yahoo tables. If you click on the community tables link, it brings in all the tables from GitHub. You can also, there's a search input box where you can search against three points of data in the data tables. You could search against the data table name, the items in the data description, and the author's name as well. So if I wanted to find all the tables that were created by myself, I could just enter it in there. Okay, so let me talk about some various console parameters that you could add that will help you with your YQL development. And the first one is debug equals true. And what this does is basically tell the YQL engine not to cache your external table. So if you're developing an open table, by default, YQL caches it. And if you use the use statement and you run your query, you'll see that if you change the file on your server, that it's using a cached version. To make sure that engine doesn't do that, just add debug equals true. It also hot links the ID attribute in the URL node in diagnostics. And that link links to the HTTP header dumping tool. And the link looks like this. So when you add the debug parameter into the console, it gives you this extra bit of information where you can actually click on that link right there, and it takes you to this page right here, the HTTP header dumping tool. And it shows you the request and response headers that YQL sends and receives from the source. And for this example, I'm calling YUI blog, so I can see all the headers that it gets sent back from them, and the headers that I'm sending them, the Yahoo remote IP, the user agent. You can see all that network information. It's a great place to debug your table if something goes wrong. I would check out the header dumping tool. So there might be a time where you're working on the same table a lot, and you're going through the data table list and you're having trouble finding it. You want a way to bump up that table to the top. So you could use _UI focus with the folder name of where your table resides, and it just simply bumps that up to the top of the data tables. It's great if you're using the same table over and over. And then we have diagnostics equals true, which is on by default in the console. It's not a passable parameter to the console, but it is passable to the REST endpoint. And what it shows is some cool information. If the table is public or if it needs authentication, it shows the YQL build number. You could go to YQLblog.net. When we do a release, we usually update the blog with release notes, so you could see, based on the build number, what new features were added or what bugs were fixed. It's a good reference point. And then we also show system time and user time. And what system time is the total amount of time it took YQL to gather the data that was needed for your query. And user time is the time it took for YQL to give you that data. Now, when YQL does your parallel request, you save time. So when the user time is less than the service time, then you know that YQL saved you time. And for this example, it saved me about 1 second of time savings. And I've seen examples where YQL has saved me about up to 5 seconds of time. And when you're doing front-end development, you want to make sure things are coming back very quickly. Again, with diagnostics true, you want to remove it from your actual YQL call to reduce the payload size. It's just extra information that you don't need when you're using your real web application. It's really meant for the console and debugging your output. So I talked about the YQL console, some of the features of the YQL console, and some parameters that you could add that will help you with your development. Now let's talk about how to use YQL data with YUI. And I'll first start with the public endpoint. Now, the public endpoint is really easy to use. There's no authentication that's needed. You could just go to that URL, enter your Q parameter with the YQL statement, and you get data back. Most tables are accessible through the public endpoint. So when I'm creating my queries and I'm clicking through the tables, a quick way to see if that table is publicly accessible or not is looking at the REST query. If the public path is in there, then I know automatically that I can access that through the public endpoint. If not, then I know I need to use some authentication. So YUI3 has this great YQL module that's really easy to use. You can just add the YQL module in the use statement there, and the first argument that it takes is the YQL query. You don't have to worry about the REST endpoint. You just enter the YQL query there. The second argument is the callback, which does the processing of the data when YQL returns the data. And for this example, I'm looking at BuzzLog, and I'm looking at the trending actors on there. So because I don't know what these actors really look like, I'm going to do another query that goes against the search.images table that looks up the images for that particular actor. So this little application here just returns a big image file that shows me the top 5 images of those actors that are trending on BuzzLog. And again, it's really easy to use. It's about 11 lines of code. By default, the YUI YQL module uses the public endpoint, and it uses the community tables environment. Another way to get YQL data from YUI is using the datasource.get module. And it's a little more advanced. For this example, you actually have to enter the REST endpoint. So on the top here with the source parameter, you enter the public endpoint followed by the format equals JSON. The second one is followed by the callback, if it's successful or not. That's what you can run. And then the data source module has these cool plugins, and one of them is the data source JSON schema, which you can basically fine-tune the data and display the data in the way you want it to. And finally, the send request, where you URL encode the actual parameters. So the Q parameter with your YQL statement has to be URL encoded. And again, this one is a very easy example as well. It's about 23 lines of code. So those are the two YUI3 modules you can use to access YQL data with the public endpoint. So there's some limitations with the public endpoint. You only get about 1,000 calls per hour per IP. So caching is your friend, especially if the application becomes really successful and you want to cache it on your end so you don't run into these rate limits. OK, let's talk about two-legged OAuth and how to use YUI to access YQL data that requires two-legged OAuth. So why would I use two-legged OAuth? Well, it gives you higher rate limits. So if the example I showed you before becomes really successful, you'll want higher rate limits. And by signing your request with two-legged OAuth, you get 10,000 calls per hour because we know who you are. So we give you a little more rate limiting. And you also need, if you need to access tables with security equals app, then you need to sign your request with two-legged OAuth. So what's the process of getting two-legged OAuth working? Well, the first thing I need to do is go to developer.apps.yahoo.com/dashboard/create-key. And I go to this form. For this example, the kind of application, I'll just use client desktop. And for the access scope, since I'm accessing only RSS and public web services, I click on the top radio button, click on the terms of use, and get my API key. And this is how you get your keys. You're then presented with the consumer key on the top, the secret in the middle, and you don't have to worry about the application ID for this example. Those are the two things that you need to know, the key and the secret. So how do I use YUI3 to access two-legged YQL data? Well, it's really easy again. You just add in the gallery OAuth module, which wraps around the previous example that I showed you, and you just enter the key and secret parameters on the bottom, and you specify the base endpoint, which is the authenticated endpoint. It doesn't have the public one in there. Again, 15 lines of code, and you instantly got higher rate limits. So how do I use YQL to call two-legged OAuth services? Yeah.
Where can we get this? Is it going to be available later?
Yeah, I'll provide the code examples. Thanks. So how do I use YQL to call two-legged OAuth services? And an example of that is the Netflix service, which requires two-legged OAuth. If you go to datatables.org/Netflix, netflixcatalog.xml, you can view the source. And this is the execute statement that we use to access Netflix's API using two-legged OAuth. It's very, very easy and very short. It's about 22 lines of code as well. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but if you view that source, you can use that as a base template to access other two-legged OAuth services. So the first thing I want to do when I use this Netflix table is to do a described Netflix catalog. And what it shows me is the various keys that I need to fill to make this query successful. So the first term is actually term, is where I enter my movie that I want to look up on Netflix. And the CK and CKS keys, which I can get on developer.netflix.com. It's the same kind of sign-on process to get your keys. Because I'm sending over keys and secrets, I could see from the describe that I need HTTPS. So anything that's going over the wire needs that protocol. So how do I construct this query? Well, I could use this query builder, which is basically something that we recently added to the console that provides a form to construct your query. So you enter your movie term, the keys that you got from Netflix, and secret, and you just hit test. And it constructs the query for you like that. Now, there's a problem with this. It's exposing my key and secret out into the open. So when I use my YUI YQL module, and if someone views source, everyone can see that key and secret. So how do I fix that? First, I want to break away the key and secret from the actual query that I want to use. And I could do that using the set keyword. So by declaring set CK on Netflix catalog and set CKS on Netflix catalog, it's essentially the same query, but now I broke that key part away from the main query that I want to use in the YQL YUI module. So how do I go about creating a custom environment to hide my CK and CKS? Well, the first thing I need to do is use the env keyword to tell the custom environment where the table I want lives. And then again, I use the set keywords to set the keys and secrets on the Netflix catalog tables. And then in the end, I basically make it one big string here. So this bottom part is just a big string delineated by the semicolons. And this is the value that I'm going to insert into YQL storage to get my custom environment. So you use YQL storage to hide your two-legged OAuth secrets. And this is the query that I would use to enter the data into YQL storage. I go insert into YQL storage admin and the string that I showed you on the screen before. Now, when I run that query, it gives me back 3 nodes. It gives me back an execute, select, and update node. Each has its own access key that can only be used to operate on that particular keyword, like execute or select. So if I needed to, if I used the execute access key and I wanted to see what the contents were, and I did select star from storage where name equals that, it wouldn't return the actual content. I need the access key that was assigned to the select. And for me to update something, I need the access key to update something from the update node. So for me to use the custom environment, I want to use the access key that was assigned to the execute node. And that's what I'm going to do to hide my secrets. So here's the query that I want. It's the Netflix catalog query without this consumer key and keyword. You can see from the console that it's been run successfully. And how do I do that? Well, I added the environment parameter to the console URL with the data store key, which contains the Netflix consumer secret. I can also add that EMV to the REST endpoint, but just for the console example, that's how you do it. So how do I use YUI3 to access this data? Well, instead of using the YUI base module, I'll have to use the YQL request method. And the reason for that is because I need to specify the protocol, which is HTTPS. So the first argument, again, is just the actual query that I want to make against the Netflix catalog. The second is the callback. And I change the base to the authenticated endpoint. And for the environment, I use the execute access key, which has my consumer key and secret in it. So why do I want to use YQL.storage? Well, it adds a level of indirection between the secrets and the user. The set calls are scoped to particular tables. Exposing the execute key only gives access to that table versus all the data accessible via that, the actual secrets. And an analogy is give the gardener the key to the backyard rather than the master key of the house. So let's talk about how to access three-legged OAuth data with YQL. So I'll talk about when to use three-legged OAuth with YQL, how to find tables that require three-legged OAuth, how to get YQL data via three-legged OAuth, setting up your CK and CKS, it's slightly different, and some example code. So why would I need to use three-legged OAuth? Well, if I have a web application that needs to access user data that requires user authentication so that that web application could read that data, that's when I need to use three-legged OAuth. And for my example here, which you could check out from that link, it's basically showing the unread messages in my Yahoo inbox. And I have a lot of unread mail there. So when you first go to that link, you're prompted with several screens. First, you have to sign into Yahoo if you're not signed in. It shows you what application is calling. And then you're prompted with this other screen where you agree to authorize that web application to access your Yahoo Mail data. Now, this is where you could either leave or actually hit accept. And then after you hit accept, you're bounced back to this page. Now, how do I find tables that require three-legged OAuth? Well, I could use show tables, which gives me the listing of all the tables and look at the various attributes. Or I could use YQL itself. I could do select star from Yahoo table list where security equals user. And it shows me all the tables that require three-legged OAuth. Now, how do I start my three-legged OAuth process? Well, again, you need to go to developer.appsyahoo.com to get your keys. This is slightly different. You need to select web-based as your kind of application. Then you enter your application endpoint in the application URL, enter your application domain. And because we're accessing private data, you need to click on this app requires access to private user data. And then the source. You can actually specify if you need read access, write access, or both. And for my example, I'm just using read summary because I would just want to see the count of my unread mail. And then you go back to the console and you try out your query to streamline and shape the data. So I use projection and filtering to get exactly the data that I need for my application without bringing in all other data sources that I don't need. So how do I go about calling YQL with three-legged OAuth? Well, Yahoo provides some social SDKs that are located on GitHub/Yahoo for the most popular programming languages: PHP, Python, Java, ActionScript, Objective-C, and .NET. And for my example, I use PHP. It's very easy to use again. There's not many lines of code to get you started. You first include the library on top. Then you define your keys and secrets. And then there's this one function, Yahoo Session, that actually does the authenticating part. That's the one function that checks to see if you have the right tokens, and if you don't, it sends you to the login screen. And then you set up your YQL statement, you feed it into the query method, and then you can get your data back. And if you go to just.github.com, 667.462, you can see the source. So this is the HTML part of the page. Because I'm using PHP and I have the data, I don't need YUI to actually do an AJAX call or a JSONP call. I already have the data immediately. So I could just echo out the response right in line into my web page. If I happen to need to use YUI, I could just echo out the JSON encoded version into a JSON string variable and operate from there. And again, this is the end result of that example. So I talked about how you use YQL data with YUI, using the public endpoint and the authenticated endpoints with two-legged OAuth, storing the secrets with YQL storage, and how to access three-legged OAuth data with YQL. Now, there's some best practices that I want to add. Don't add random parameters to the YQL endpoint. What that does, it busts the cache, which means it will take longer for the YQL engine to get your data back, something that you don't want to do. So in my previous example, I did select star from ymail.folders, and this is the tree view. And you can see that I have about 14 folders in my Yahoo email. And I just wanted the unread count of my inbox, not the other folders. And this is all the extra data that I don't need. So use projection and local filtering to reduce your payload size. So instead of having all that extra data, you could just project it that way and use local filtering to narrow into the data that you need. And if you know your data isn't going to change often, use _maxage, which will lengthen the YQL cache, and it's set in seconds. And that's the end of my talk. If you have any questions, please ask them, and thank you for listening.